I stand on the eastern ridge of what everyone in Millbrook now calls Ashford Point, though the faded sign still reads Blackthorn Salvage Yard. 4 months have passed since the night Vivian locked me out of the only home I had ever known. The Wyoming wind carries the scent of pine and distant snow, and I can still feel the ghost of that first terrible cold, the kind that turns your breath to ice crystals before it leaves your lungs. People ask me how a 15-year-old boy survived what should have been a death sentence. They want a simple answer, something clean and heroic. But survival is never simple, and the truth is, I spent the first 72 hours certain I was going to die. The story does not begin on the night Vivian threw me out. It begins 3 years earlier when my father first took me to the salvage yard on my 12th birthday. We stood exactly where I am standing now, and he pointed to the rusted hulks of rail cars half buried in decades of prairie grass. His hand was steady on my shoulder, his voice quiet but deliberate. "Someday you will need to know how to make something from nothing, Finn. The earth keeps what the sky tries to steal." I did not understand then. I thought he was teaching me about metalwork, about welding seams and reading soil composition. I did not know he was preparing me for the day I would have to build a life from scrap iron and frozen dirt. My father, Thaddeus Ashford, died on a Tuesday in late January. The official cause was heart failure, sudden and catastrophic, though he had never shown a single symptom of cardiac distress. He was 51 years old, strong as bridge cable, and 3 days before his death, he had carried a 200-pound anvil up a flight of stairs without breaking stride. The funeral was held on a Friday, and I remember the way the winter sun slanted through the stained glass windows of St. Matthias Church, casting colored shadows across the closed casket. Vivian stood beside me in black silk, her face a perfect mask of grief, her hand resting lightly on my arm as if she were the one holding me upright. The touch felt like a shackle. She had married my father 6 years earlier when I was 9 and still reeling from my mother's death. Vivienne was elegant, controlled, and utterly uninterested in me beyond the social performance of stepmother. We existed in separate orbits within Ashford Manor, crossing paths only at dinner or during the rare charity events she insisted on hosting. My father worked long hours at his engineering firm and spent his weekends teaching me things Vivian found distasteful: how to read topographic maps, how to build a fire in wet conditions, how to identify edible plants and set snares for rabbits. She would watch from the manor windows, her expression hovering somewhere between disdain and calculation. The will was read 3 days after the funeral in Harlan Wolff's law office, a space that smelled of leather and old paper, and something sour I could not identify. Wolff was a man built from sharp angles, all elbows and cheekbones, his suit expensive but somehow wrong on his frame. He read the terms in a voice devoid of emotion. 70% of the Ashford estate, including the manor and controlling shares in Ashford Engineering, would pass to Vivian. 30%, including a piece of property identified only as Blackthorn Salvage Yard, would pass to me upon my 18th birthday. Until then, Vivian would serve as executor and manager of all assets. The room felt airless. I looked at Vivian and saw her shoulders relax, a tension I had not noticed draining away. Wolff slid a stack of papers across the mahogany desk, his long fingers tapping the signature line. "Given your age, Finn, it would be prudent to sign management authority over to your stepmother. Standard practice for minors with inheritance complications." I thought of my father's last words to me, spoken 2 weeks before his death during one of our weekend sessions at the salvage yard. We were bent over a schematic for a root cellar, his pencil scratching calculations in the margins. He had stopped mid-sentence, set the pencil down, and looked at me with an intensity that pinned me in place. "If anyone ever asks you to sign something you do not fully understand, walk away. Do not let fear or pressure or politeness make you surrender your autonomy. A man who signs away his power deserves what he gets." I pushed the papers back across the desk. My hands were shaking, but my voice came out steady. I need to read these first. I need to understand what I am signing. Vivian's mask slipped for just a fraction of a second, a flash of something cold and sharp. Wolf's smile was thin as a razor cut. Of course. Take your time. Though I should mention that the salvage yard requires immediate oversight. Property taxes, liability insurance, environmental compliance. Without active management, the county can seize it within 60 days. I felt the trap closing but could not see all its edges yet. I will manage it myself. Vivian laughed, a sound like glass breaking. Darling, you are 15 years old. You cannot legally manage a property. The words were silk over steel. You need a guardian's signature regardless. The question is whether you want to be involved in the decisions or trust me to handle the details. I met her eyes and saw my father's death reflected there, a convenient accident that had handed her everything she wanted. I saw the future she had planned for me, marginalized, controlled, eventually squeezed out entirely. The anger that rose in my chest was clean and sharp, burning away the grief that had dulled my thoughts for days. I stood up the chair, scraping against expensive hardwood. Then I choose to be involved. I will live on the property and manage it directly. The silence that followed was profound. Wolf recovered first, his expression shifting to something like pity. The property is uninhabitable, Finn. It is 20 acres of rusted metal and contaminated soil 40 miles outside Millbrook. There is no house, no running water, no electricity. You cannot possibly. I can. My father taught me how. The words came out harder than I intended, each one a small stone thrown at the careful edifice of their manipulation. Vivian stood gathering her coat with movements that were too controlled, too precise. Very well. If you insist on this foolishness, you can have your salvage yard. But understand that you are choosing poverty and hardship over family and security. You are choosing to reject everything your father built for you. He built that salvage yard. I am choosing to honor what he actually valued, not what you think I should inherit. Her face went very still. Wolf cleared his throat, shuffling papers with unnecessary vigor. I will draw up the modified documents. Finn will retain direct ownership and management of Blackthorn Salvage Yard. Vivian will maintain control of all other assets. We can finalize everything next week. I walked out of that office knowing I had won a battle, but not understanding the shape of the war. Vivian did not speak to me on the drive back to Ashford Manor. She stared out the window at the winter landscape, her reflection ghostly in the glass, and I felt the cold radiating off her in waves. That night I packed a single backpack, 3 changes of clothes, my father's hunting knife, a waterproof tin containing matches and a ferrocerium rod, and the leather-bound journal where he had written years of technical notes and survival instructions. I did not pack sentiment or comfort. I packed function. Somewhere around midnight I heard Vivian on the phone in her study, her voice low and urgent, though I could not make out the words. I pressed my ear to the door and caught only fragments, liability, and property value, and make sure it is clean. The sense of danger crystallized in that moment. Vivian was not simply letting me go to fail on my own. She was planning something, orchestrating an outcome that went beyond mere abandonment. I retreated to my room and triple-checked my pack, mentally cataloging every skill my father had drilled into me over the years. Fire-making in wet conditions, shelter construction from minimal materials, water purification, calorie conservation. The lessons had seemed excessive at the time, almost paranoid in their thoroughness. Now they felt like the careful preparation of a man who knew his son would need every advantage to survive what was coming. The next morning dawned clear and brutally cold. The weather report called for temperatures dropping to -22 Fahrenheit by evening, with a blizzard forecast to arrive before midnight. Vivian came to my room as I was shouldering my pack, her expression serene as church marble. I have arranged transportation to your new property. The car will be here in 10 minutes. I had expected resistance argument, some final attempt to maintain control. The ease of her capitulation felt wrong, like stepping on ground that looked solid but gave way beneath your weight. I followed her downstairs where two security guards I had never seen before waited by the front entrance. She handed me a manila envelope containing the property deed, a hand-drawn map, and $40 in cash. Everything you need. The guards will ensure you arrive safely. One of them opened the door and frozen air rushed in, sharp enough to make my eyes water. Ember, my father's wolf-dog hybrid, pushed past me and stood on the threshold, his thick fur already rimed with frost. He was 7 years old, gray and amber, with eyes the color of winter sunlight, and he had been my father's constant companion until the day he died. I had not asked if I could bring him. I simply bent down, hooked my fingers through his collar, and stepped out into the cold. The sedan that carried us away from Ashford Manor was black and anonymous, the kind of vehicle that left no impression. I sat in the back with Ember pressed against my leg, his warmth a small defiance against the creeping cold. The driver said nothing for the entire 40-mile journey, and I watched the landscape transform from manicured estates to working ranches to empty prairie punctuated by the skeletal remains of long-dead industry. The salvage yard appeared as a dark smudge on the horizon, a sprawl of rusted metal and collapsed structures that looked like the bones of something massive and long extinct. The driver stopped at the edge of the property, pointed to a gap in the chain-link fence, and told me to get out. I stood there holding my pack while the sedan reversed and drove away, its taillights disappearing into the gray distance. The temperature was already dropping, the sky the color of old iron, and the wind carried the promise of the coming storm. Ember lifted his nose and scented the air, his hackles rising slightly before settling. He looked at me with an expression I wanted to interpret as confidence, but probably was just canine acceptance of whatever madness his human had chosen. I had 4 hours of daylight left, 4 hours to find shelter, make fire, and create enough insulation to survive a night that would kill me if I made even one mistake. The salvage yard stretched out before me like a graveyard of America's industrial ambitions. Rail cars from the 1950s, mining equipment from the copper boom, rusted truck chassis, and collapsed Quonset huts, and tangles of cable thick as my wrist. My father had spent 3 years acquiring this property, buying up scrap lots and abandoned infrastructure for pennies on the dollar, and I had never understood why. Now, walking through the debris field with the wind beginning to pick up, and the first ice crystals stinging my face, I felt the terrible weight of his foresight. The journal was in my pack, wrapped in waxed canvas to keep it dry. I pulled it out and flipped to the pages marked with a red ribbon, sections my father had flagged months ago. The first entry was dated 2 years before his death. Railcar, 17 structural integrity, good floor access, modified southern exposure. Optimal. Beneath the text was a hand-drawn schematic showing the interior layout of a specific car, with measurements and annotations in my father's precise technical script. The second page showed a cutaway view of the ground beneath the rail car, revealing a hidden space accessed through a trapdoor in the floor. I found Railcar 17 half buried in a drift on the eastern edge of the property, its oxidized shell the color of dried blood. The sliding door was frozen shut, but gave way when I struck it with a length of pipe shrieking open just wide enough for my body to slip through. Inside, the air was still and somehow colder than outside the metal walls, sucking heat from any living thing foolish enough to touch them. Ember squeezed in behind me, his breath visible in small clouds. The tin box was exactly where the journal said it would be, tucked beneath a rotted floorboard in the northwest corner. I pried it open with my knife and found 3 things. A sheaf of yellowed papers covered in my father's handwriting, a small leather pouch that clinked when I shook it, and a photograph of my parents on their wedding day, both of them young and impossibly alive. The papers were instructions, step-by-step procedures for everything from building a root cellar to purifying water to treating frostbite. The pouch contained 5 gold coins, each one stamped with the year of my birth. The last page of the bundle was a letter addressed to me in my father's hand. Finn, if you are reading this, I am gone, and Vivian has shown her true nature. I suspected for months that she was poisoning me, though I could never gather proof she would not destroy. This salvage yard is not worthless. Beneath the scrap is something that will make you wealthy if you survive long enough to claim it. More important than wealth is the knowledge I have tried to give you. The earth provides for those who understand her language. Build down, not up. Trust the old methods. And remember that the coldest nights produce the brightest stars. I love you. Live. My hands were shaking as I folded the letter and returned it to the tin. The grief that crashed over me was physical, a pressure that made it hard to breathe. My father had known he was dying. He had known who was killing him, and instead of fighting or running or calling the police, he had prepared this refuge and trusted me to find it. The weight of that trust felt heavier than the frozen air pressing against the railcar walls. I had no time for grief. The temperature was plummeting and the wind was picking up the first scout gusts of the blizzard that would arrive within hours. I used the hatchet from my pack to pry up the floorboards in the center of the car, exposing the trap door my father had installed. The hinges were stiff with old grease but functional. I heaved it open and stared down into absolute darkness, a rectangular void that smelled of damp earth and mineral cold. The ladder was crude, but solid iron rungs hammered into a wooden frame. I descended into the dark with Ember whining above me, his reluctance to follow warring with his reluctance to be separated. 8 feet down, my boots hit packed dirt. I struck a match, and the small flame revealed a space roughly 10 feet square, the walls shored up with timber, and the ceiling low enough that I could touch it by reaching up. The air temperature was noticeably warmer than the surface, hovering somewhere around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, due to the insulating properties of the earth itself. My father's preparations were meticulous. Against the north wall stood a small iron stove, its chimney pipe already installed and venting up through a concealed channel that would disperse the smoke. Beside it was a stack of split firewood bone dry and ready to burn. The eastern wall held shelves containing sealed mason jars of dried corn beans and salt, along with a dozen candles and 2 wool blankets that smelled of cedar and thyme. The western wall was raw earth, and when I held my match close I could see something glinting in the packed soil, a vein of metallic blue running through the clay like frozen lightning. I called for Ember, and he came scrambling down the ladder with awkward haste and pressing himself against my legs once he reached the bottom. I pulled him close and felt his heart hammering against his ribs, fear and cold and confusion all mixed together. "It is all right," I told him, though I had no idea if that was true. "We are going to survive this." The first night was the longest of my life. I built a small fire in the stove, feeding it carefully, and watching the flames catch and grow, casting warm shadows against the earth walls. The chimney drew properly, pulling the smoke up and away, and within an hour the space had warmed to something approaching livable. I ate a handful of dried corn and gave Ember twice that amount, both of us too exhausted to do more than chew mechanically. The wind above us rose to a howl, a freight train sound that vibrated through the ground itself, and I lay on the dirt floor, wrapped in both blankets, with Ember curled against my chest, and tried not to think about how many things could still go wrong. Sleep came in fragments, shallow and dream-haunted. I woke every few hours to feed the fire, to check that the ventilation was still drawing, to press my hand against Ember's side and confirm he was still breathing. The cold was a living presence, patient and relentless, probing for any weakness in our small fortress of earth and fire. By morning I was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness, the kind of bone-deep weariness that comes from spending 12 hours certain you might not see another sunrise. The storm broke on the third day. I emerged from the root cellar into a world transformed, the salvage yard buried under 3 feet of fresh snow that glittered in the weak sunlight like crushed diamonds. The temperature had risen to an almost balmy -10 degrees, and I could work outside for 15 minutes at a time before my fingers went numb and useless. I spent that first week in a pattern that became ritual: wake before dawn, feed the fire, eat a sparse breakfast, work outside until the cold forced me back down, warm myself by the stove work. Some more sleep, repeat. My father's journal contained detailed instructions for improving the root cellar, and I followed them with religious precision. I dug a U-shaped trench for the ventilation system, forcing the incoming air to travel underground before entering the living space, which allowed the earth to pre-warm it and prevented drafts. I scavenged old tarps and moth-eaten wool rugs from the debris field and hung them 6 inches away from the earth walls, creating pockets of dead air that acted as insulation. I found a 55-gallon drum and converted it into a more efficient stove, cutting intake holes and running the exhaust through a horizontal channel beneath the floor, so the metal absorbed and radiated heat long after the fire died. The work was brutal. My hands cracked and bled, the cold sapping my strength, until tasks that should have taken minutes stretched into hours. I set snares using copper wire stripped from old vehicle alternators, placing them along the leeward side of the junk piles where brush rabbits sought shelter from the wind. The first 3 days I caught nothing. On the 4th day I found a small cottontail frozen in the wire, its eyes glazed and empty, and I felt a savage triumph that scared me a little. I skinned it with my father's knife, boiled the meat in melted snow, and split the thin broth with ember. It tasted of iron and desperation, and it was the best meal I had ever eaten. On the 8th day, I decided to expand the sleeping platform. The root cellar's floor was adequate but damp, and I could feel the moisture beginning to seep into my lungs, a tightness that warned of pneumonia if I did not address it. I swung the hatchet at the western wall, intending to carve out a shallow shelf that would keep me elevated above the ground moisture. The blade bit into the packed earth with a solid thunk, then rang with a clear metallic note that stopped me mid-swing. I cleared the loose soil with my bare hands, my heartbeat accelerating as more of the metallic vein became visible. It was not iron. The color was wrong, a deep blue-purple that seemed to absorb and reflect light simultaneously, and the texture was smoother than any ore I had seen in my father's collection. I consulted the journal and found a section I had skipped over labeled Mineralogical Survey, Confidential. The entry was technical and dense, filled with chemical formulas and market projections, but the core message was clear. The salvage yard sat atop an untapped tantalum deposit, estimated at 50 tons, with a conservative market value of $20 to $30 million. I sat back on my heels, the implications cascading through my mind like falling dominoes. My father had not bought a junkyard. He had bought a fortune and camouflaged it with scrap metal. Vivian had not thrown me into poverty. She had exiled me to the one piece of property she did not understand was valuable, the one asset she had dismissed as worthless. The irony was so sharp it felt like a physical blade. I kept digging, driven by a mixture of avarice and curiosity, and 2 feet deeper, my hatchet struck something that was definitely not stone. I excavated carefully, brushing away the soil to reveal the iron-bound corner of a wooden chest. It took me an hour to fully expose it, and when I finally dragged it free from the wall, it was heavy enough that I had to brace my legs and use my whole body to shift it. The lid was sealed with a massive padlock, and burned into the wood above the lock was a single word in my father's handwriting: retribution. The chest was too heavy to lift, too solid to break open with the tools I had. I tried prying the lock with my knife and nearly snapped the blade. I tried using the hatchet as a lever and succeeded only in denting the wood. Ember watched my efforts with patient incomprehension. His head tilted, and I finally gave up and sat beside the chest with my back against the cool earth. Whatever my father had locked inside would have to wait until I could find proper tools or someone with the skill to open it without destroying the contents. The wind above had died to nothing. The silence, after a week of constant howling, almost unnerving. I climbed the ladder and pushed open the trapdoor, emerging into the rail car just as the sun was setting behind the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rust. The temperature had dropped again, my breath turning to frost the moment it left my lungs, and I was about to retreat back into the warmth when I heard a rhythmic thumping, like someone beating a drum with slow deliberation. The sound was coming from outside the rail car. I moved to the gap in the sliding door and peered out into the gathering dusk. At first I saw nothing but snow and shadow. Then the thumping came again, closer now, and I realized it was not a drum. It was footsteps, heavy and irregular, the gait of someone struggling through deep snow. A figure emerged from behind a collapsed Quonset hut, moving with the slow determination of someone operating on nothing but willpower. I could not make out details in the failing light, but the shape was human, bundled in dark clothing and clearly in distress. They took 3 more steps, stumbled, caught themselves, and then collapsed face first into the snow 20 yards from my position. Ember was already moving, scrambling out through the gap and bounding through the drifts before I could call him back. I followed, my heart hammering, snow filling my boots as I ran. I reached the fallen figure and rolled them over, brushing ice crystals from a face that was ash-gray and deeply lined, a woman somewhere in her late 60s with frost on her eyelashes and blue lips. She was barely breathing, her core temperature dropping into the kill zone, and I recognized with a shock of displaced memory the woman I had seen exactly twice before, once at my father's funeral, standing in the back of the church, and once years earlier when she had come to Ashford Manor carrying something wrapped in oilcloth that she refused to leave with anyone but my father himself. Her eyes fluttered open for just a moment, pale and unfocused. Willa Crane. The name came out as barely a whisper, her breath smelling of metal and exhaustion. Thaddeus sent me. You need to know what they did. Then she was unconscious, her body going limp in my arms, and I was lifting her despite my own exhaustion, carrying her through the snow toward the rail car, while Ember circled us both, and the last light drained from the western sky. Getting Willa down the ladder nearly killed us both. She was dead weight in my arms, her breathing shallow and irregular, frost still clinging to her eyebrows and the loose strands of silver hair that had escaped from beneath her wool cap. Ember went first, his claws scrabbling against the iron rungs, and I followed with Willa draped across my shoulders in a fireman's carry that made every muscle in my back scream. Twice I nearly lost my grip. Twice I caught myself by wedging my elbow against the ladder frame and simply refusing to fall. The root cellar felt tropical after the killing cold outside. I laid Willa on the dirt floor near the stove and began the methodical work of warming someone back from the edge of hypothermia. My father had drilled this into me during our winter camping trips. Core temperature first, extremities never. Heating the arms and legs too quickly floods the heart with cold blood and stops it dead. I built up the fire until the stove glowed cherry red, then gathered the smoothest river stones from the corner where I had been stockpiling them. I buried 6 stones in the coals and waited until they were hot enough to make spit dance and evaporate. Using strips torn from one of the wool blankets, I wrapped each stone and placed them strategically, one under each armpit, one at the groin, one against the small of her back. The largest I wrapped twice and positioned against her abdomen, right over the core vessels that would carry warmth back to her vital organs. She did not stir. Her skin had the waxy translucence of someone hovering in the space between life and something else, and I found myself talking to her in a low, continuous stream. Words I do not remember, anything to fill the silence and convince myself she was still capable of hearing. It took 3 hours before her eyelids fluttered, another hour before her breathing deepened and steadied. I fed the fire and rotated the stones, replacing cooled ones with fresh heat, and somewhere in that vigil Ember curled himself against her side and added his own warmth to the equation. When her eyes finally opened fully, they were pale gray sharp despite the ordeal, and they fixed on me with an intensity that made me want to look away. "You look like him." Her voice was gravel scraped across concrete, ruined by the cold but functional. "Same stubborn jaw, same way of standing like the world might knock you down, but you will get back up anyway." I brought her water, heated with a stone from the fire, held the tin cup while she drank in small, careful sips. "You knew my father. Thaddeus Ashford was the best blacksmith I ever trained. Not the most talented, but the most deliberate. He understood that metal has memory, that you cannot force it without consequence." She pushed herself upright with effort, her hands shaking. "I taught him everything I knew about working iron, and he taught me that some people are worth saving even when they do not ask for help." The statement hung between us, weighted with meaning I could not quite parse. Outside, the wind had picked up again, a low moan that filtered through the ventilation channels. I waited, feeding the fire, giving her time to gather whatever she had come here to say. "Your father came to my forge 4 months before he died, middle of September. One of those clear autumn days when you can see all the way to the Montana border. He brought a leather case and made me promise not to open it unless something happened to him, and even then only to give it to you." Her gaze did not waver. I knew something was wrong. He had lost weight, his color was off, and his hands shook when he thought I was not watching. But Thaddeus was a proud man, and I respected that pride enough not to press. "What was in the case?" She reached beneath her coat and withdrew a flat package wrapped in oilcloth, the edges sealed with wax that had cracked during her journey. I took it with hands that were steadier than I felt and broke the seal. Inside was a sheaf of documents, photographs, and a thumb drive in a protective case. The first photograph showed my father and Vivian at some charity gala, both of them smiling for the camera. The second showed Vivian alone in my father's study, her hand reaching for something on his desk. The third showed Harlan Wolfe entering the rear entrance of Ashford Manor at 2 a.m. The documents were medical. Lab reports from a private testing facility in Denver showing elevated levels of arsenic in hair and nail samples submitted under a pseudonym. A timeline in my father's handwriting documenting symptoms: muscle weakness, nausea, hair loss, confusion, numbness in extremities. A second timeline tracking Vivian's travel schedule and noting that symptoms always worsened after she returned from her monthly trips to visit her sister in Cheyenne. A receipt for a bottle of wine purchased from a specialty importer, the vintage rare enough to be worth photographing. The final document was a letter written in my father's hand, dated 2 weeks before his death. "Finn, I do not have proof that will stand in court, but I have enough to know the shape of my murder. Vivian has been feeding me arsenic trioxide, probably dissolved in the scotch she insists on pouring for me each evening. The doses are small and carefully spaced to mimic natural illness. By the time you read this, I will be dead, and she will have gotten away with it unless you are willing to fight." The thumb drive contains security footage from the hidden camera I installed in my study. The timestamp is October 12th, 9:47 p.m. Watch it, then decide what kind of man you want to be. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the papers. Willa watched me with an expression that might have been pity or might have been recognition, the look of someone who has seen this story play out before and knows there are no good endings, only bearable ones. He knew. The words felt torn from somewhere deep in my chest. He knew she was killing him, and he did nothing. He did what he could. Willa's voice was soft but unyielding. "He could not prove it without destroying you in the process. Vivian made sure of that. If he had accused her publicly, she would have painted him as paranoid and delusional symptoms of mental illness brought on by grief over your mother. She would have had him committed, taken control of everything, and you would have been left completely unprotected. Instead, he built you this. She gestured at the root cellar at the stove and the supplies and the hidden wealth in the walls. He gave you the tools to survive and the evidence to fight back when you were ready. I wanted to scream. I wanted to put my fist through the earth wall and feel something break. Instead, I sat very still and felt the grief crystallize into something harder and colder, the kind of anger that does not burn hot, but rather settles into your bones and changes the way you see the world. Vivian had killed my father with poison and patience, and she had done it for money, for control, for the simple exercise of power over someone who had made the mistake of trusting her. The thumb drive contained a single video file. I had no way to view it in the root cellar, no laptop or phone or any device with a screen, but I did not need to watch it to know what it would show. The timestamp was specific, the context clear. My father had documented his own murder and hidden the evidence where only I would find it. Willa coughed a wet sound that rattled in her chest, and when she pulled her hand away there were flecks of blood on her palm. The cold had gotten into her lungs, the beginning of pneumonia setting in, and I knew with sick certainty that she would die here if I did not get her to proper medical care within days. The nearest hospital was in Millbrook, 50 miles of frozen wasteland away, and I was a 15-year-old boy with no vehicle, no phone, and no reason to believe anyone would help us even if we made it that far. There is more. Willa's breathing was labored, but her eyes remained focused. The chest, the one with Thaddeus's handwriting on the lid. I can open it. I stared at her. How I am a blacksmith boy. I have been working metal since before your father was born. Locks are just puzzles made of pins and springs, and I know every puzzle worth knowing. She pushed herself to her feet with visible effort, swayed once, and caught herself against the wall. But I need tools, something to work with. I scavenged through the debris I had accumulated, strips of wire, a broken screwdriver, a length of rebar filed to a point. Willa examined each piece with the critical eye of a craftsman, assessing raw materials, selected 3, and moved to the chest with the careful deliberation of someone operating on limited reserves of strength. She knelt beside it, pressed her ear against the metal lock plate, and began working the wire into the keyhole with movements so small and precise they were almost invisible. 10 minutes passed. 20. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the faint scrape of metal on metal. Ember watched from his position near the stove, his amber eyes tracking Willa's hands, and I found myself holding my breath without meaning to. There was something ritualistic about the moment, a sense of doors opening and thresholds being crossed. And when the lock finally clicked and fell open, the sound was so quiet it might have been imagined. Willa sat back with a grunt of satisfaction. Your turn. This is your inheritance, not mine. The chest opened on hinges that shrieked with disuse. Inside, wrapped in layers of waxed canvas, were 4 bundles arranged with geometric precision. The first contained legal documents, the original deed to Blackthorn Salvage Yard, with my father's genuine signature, a stack of property surveys showing the extent of the tantalum deposit, and a forensic analysis comparing that signature to the ones on the papers I had signed in Wolf's office. The analysis was damning in its specificity. The loops were wrong, the pressure inconsistent, the angle of certain strokes physically impossible for someone with my father's hand dominance. Vivian and Wolf had forged his signature to alter the will, and my father had documented every discrepancy. The second bundle was medical, the bottle of arsenic trioxide with Vivian's fingerprints preserved under clear tape, a second set of lab reports showing the progression of poisoning over 6 months, and a handwritten log where my father had recorded every instance of symptoms correlated with meals or drinks prepared by Vivian. The evidence was methodical and devastating, the work of a man who knew he was dying and refused to let his murder go unanswered. The third bundle contained financial records showing that Vivian had been systematically looting Ashford Engineering for 2 years, transferring funds to offshore accounts through a shell corporation registered in Harlan Wolf's name. The amounts were staggering: $3 million siphoned away in increments small enough to avoid immediate detection but large enough to constitute grand larceny. The fourth bundle was a series of photographs showing Vivian and Wolf together in contexts that were unmistakably romantic: dining at expensive restaurants, entering a hotel in Denver, walking hand in hand through a park in Cheyenne. The timestamps spanned 3 years, starting 6 months after Vivian had married my father. The final photograph showed them in Wolf's law office toasting each other with champagne, and the date stamp was 2 days before my father's death. I spread everything across the dirt floor, creating a mosaic of betrayal and premeditation, and felt something fundamental shift in my understanding of the world. Vivian had not simply murdered my father for money. She had seduced him, married him, stolen from him, and then poisoned him slowly while conducting an affair with the lawyer who would help her forge the documents to steal everything. The cruelty was almost artistic in its completeness. Willa was watching me with an expression I could not read. "What will you do? I am going to destroy her." The words came out flat and certain, no heat or drama, just a statement of geological fact. "I am going to take this evidence to the authorities, and I am going to watch her go to prison for the rest of her life." Getting to the authorities means getting to Millbrook. Getting to Millbrook means crossing 50 miles of winter hell in your condition. Willa coughed again, harder this time, and I could hear the fluid gathering in her lungs. And in mine. "We have maybe 3 days before this pneumonia kills me, and you cannot carry me that distance alone. Then we start now, tonight, before the next storm comes." Willa looked at me for a long moment, something like respect flickering across her weathered features. "You sound like Thaddeus. Same kind of crazy determination that does not know when to quit." She pushed herself to her feet, swaying slightly. "All right, but we do this smart, not desperate. You need a sled, supplies, a route that avoids the deepest drifts. And you need to accept that I might not make it, which means you have to be prepared to finish this alone. I will not leave you behind." The words were out before I could consider them raw and absolute, and Willa's expression softened into something almost maternal. "I know. That is why I came here instead of mailing you the evidence and saving myself. Thaddeus told me about you, about the kind of boy you were. He said you had a capacity for loyalty that would either save you or destroy you, and the trick would be figuring out which." Her gaze held mine. "Do not let loyalty become martyrdom, Finn. The world does not reward dead heroes." The next 12 hours were a controlled frenzy of preparation. I constructed a sled from a salvaged bicycle frame and 2 sheets of corrugated plastic, lashing everything together with wire and testing the joints until I was satisfied they would hold under stress. I packed the evidence in a waterproof bag improvised from a truck tarp and duct tape. I filled a second bag with dried food matches, the ferrocerium rod, and every scrap of cloth that could serve as insulation. I fashioned a harness from toe straps designed to distribute the weight across my shoulders and chest, rather than relying on arm strength alone. Willa contributed what she could, sorting supplies and offering suggestions in a voice that grew progressively weaker. She showed me how to layer the insulation on the sled to create a protected space for her body, how to angle the plastic runners to reduce drag in deep snow, how to read the landscape for the paths of least resistance. Between instructions, she dozed fitfully, her breathing increasingly labored, and I could see the color draining from her face as the infection spread through her lungs. On the second day after her arrival, I climbed to the surface to scout our route and found fresh tire tracks in the snow. Multiple vehicles heavy enough to compress the drifts into hard-packed lanes had circled the salvage yard and stopped near the western perimeter. I followed the tracks and discovered boot prints, at least 6 different sets, all leading to the collapsed Quonset hut that marked the boundary of the tantalum deposit. Someone had been surveying the property, and they had not bothered to hide their presence. I scrambled back to the root cellar and found Willa awake, her eyes fever bright. "They are already looking." Her voice was a rasp. "Vivian must have hired someone to do a geological survey. If they find the deposit before you can claim it legally, she will manufacture new documents and take everything. How long do we have? Days, maybe a week if we are lucky and the weather slows them down." She tried to sit up and could not quite manage it. "You need to leave now, Finn. Take the evidence and go. I will slow you down too much." "No." I knelt beside her and took her hand, feeling how cold her fingers were despite the warmth of the stove. "You came here to help me. I am not repaying that by leaving you to die alone. Stubborn as your father." But there was approval in her tone, resignation mixed with something that might have been affection. "Then we need a different plan, something that buys us time." The idea came fully formed, audacious and desperate. I would give Vivian's survey team something to find a distraction elaborate enough to convince them they had discovered what they were looking for while hiding the true extent of the deposit. I spent the next 6 hours excavating a small section of the tantalum vein and carefully reburying it in a location 30 yards from the root cellar, creating what would look like a modest pocket of ore worth investigating, but not worth the cost of a major extraction operation. I scattered iron filings around the false site to confuse metal detectors and left just enough exposed material to be discovered by someone looking hard enough. The gambit relied on Vivian's greed working against her. She would assume any tantalum deposit she found represented the entirety of the resource. She would send her people to extract it, focus all her attention on that single point, and never think to look for what lay hidden 8 feet beneath a root cellar she did not know existed. On the 3rd day the weather shifted. The temperature spiked to an almost warm 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind died completely, leaving the world wrapped in the kind of profound silence that comes before major storms. The sky took on a peculiar yellowish cast, and I knew from experience that we had perhaps 18 hours before the next blizzard arrived. If we were going to move, it had to be now. I sealed the root cellar as thoroughly as I could, banking the fire to coals that would burn for days and stacking supplies where animals could not reach them. Ember watched these preparations with mounting anxiety, pacing the small space and whining low in his throat. I knelt and pressed my forehead against his, feeling the warmth